So, hello and welcome back to another adventure deep underground with Jules Verne, where we're finally getting underground. And, it's been one heck of a romp up until now, but now we're venturing into the realms of the unknown. I'm very curious to see what Mr. Verne's imagination has in store for us because I've enjoyed the characterizations so far. I feel like the professor and Axel are really well fleshed out, especially when you consider when this was written and when you consider the things like Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. That book was a lot of atmosphere, a lot of style. You could feel the streets of London, but I didn't feel like I got to know any of the characters really well. In opposition, this book, I feel like, just in the first chapter, I really felt like I had a very good picture of Axel and Professor Lindenrock. So kudos to Jules Verne. I'm enjoying the heck out of this, and I hope you are too. So, with all of that being babbled at you, let's jump back into Journey to the Center of the Earth by Jules Verne, beginning with chapter 19. The next day, Tuesday, June 30th, at 6 in the morning, the descent began again. We continued to follow the tunnel of lava, really a natural, gently sloping ramp like those inclined planes which are still found in old houses instead of staircases. And so we continued on until 17 minutes past noon, the precise moment when we rejoined Hans, who had just stopped. "Ah, here we are," said my uncle, "at the very end of the chimney." I looked around. We were standing at the intersection of two roads, both dark and narrow. Which one should we take? This was a difficulty. But my uncle did not seem to want to hesitate. He didn't seem hesitant at all, either before me or the guide. He pointed out the eastern tunnel, and all three of us were soon deep inside of it. In any case, any hesitation about this double path would have prolonged itself indefinitely, as there was no indicator or guide to our choice of one or the other. We had to leave it to chance. The slope in this tunnel was barely perceptible, and its sections very unequal. Sometimes we passed a series of arches succeeding each other like majestic arcades of a Gothic cathedral. Medieval architects could have studied all the forms of sacred architecture here that derive from the ogival arch. A mile after that, we had to bow our heads under low arches in the Roman style and massive pillars growing from the rock bent under the burden of the vaults. In certain places, this magnificence gave way to low structures which looked like beaver dams, and we had to crawl through narrow tubes. The temperature remained bearable. Involuntarily, I thought of the heat when the lava ejected from Snaffels was boiling and working its way through this now silent passage. I imagined the torrents of fire breaking at every turn in the tunnel and the accumulation of overheated steam in this environment. I only hope, I thought, that this old volcano doesn't come up with any belated fantasies. I did not convey my fears to Professor Lindenrock. He would not have understood them. His only idea was to move on. He walked, he slid, he even fell with a conviction that one could only admire. By 6 in the evening, after an undemanding walk, we had gone 2 leagues south, but scarcely a quarter of a mile down. My uncle gave the signal to rest. We ate without talking and went to sleep without any reflection. Our arrangements for the night were quite simple. A travel blanket into which we rolled ourselves was our only bedding. We had neither cold nor intrusive visits to fear. Travelers who penetrate into the wilds of Central Africa and into pathless forests in the New World are obliged to watch over each other at night. But here, absolute safety and utter seclusion. Savages or wild beasts, we did not need to fear any of those. We awoke the next morning refreshed and in good spirits, and resumed the road. As on previous days, we followed a lava path. Impossible to identify the nature of the rock that it passed through, though. The tunnel, instead of leading down into the bowels of the globe, gradually became absolutely horizontal. I even thought I noticed that it rose again towards the surface of the earth. This tendency became so obvious at about 10 in the morning, and therefore so tiring, that I was forced to slow our pace. "Well, Axel," said the professor impatiently. "Well, I can't stand it any longer," I replied. "What? After 3 hours' walk on easy ground?" "It might be easy," I said, "but it's tiring all the same." "What, when we have nothing to do but keep going down?" "We're going up." "Going up," said my uncle with a shrug. "No doubt," I told him. "For the last half hour the slopes have gone the other way, and at this rate we'll be back on the surface in Iceland." The professor shook his head, like a man who refuses to be convinced. I tried to resume the conversation, and he said not another word and gave the signal for us to depart. I saw that his silence was nothing but bad humor. Still, I courageously shouldered my burden again and rapidly followed Hans, who my uncle was in front of. I was anxious not to be left behind. My greatest care was not to lose sight of my companions. I shuddered at the thought of losing my way in the depths of this labyrinth. Besides, if the ascending road became harder, I comforted myself by thinking it was taking us closer to the surface. There was hope in this. Every step confirmed me in it, and I rejoiced at the thought of meeting my little Grauben again. At noon, there was a change in the appearance of the tunnel walls. I noticed it through a decrease in the amount of light that was reflecting from the sides. Solid rock was replacing the lava coating. The mass was made up of slanted and sometimes vertical strata. We were passing through rocks of the transition or Silurian system. "It's obvious," I exclaimed. "Marine deposits in the secondary period have formed these shales, limestones, and sandstones. We're turning away from the primary granite. We're like people from Hamburg who go to Lübeck by way of Hanover." I should have kept my observations to myself, but my geological instinct was stronger than my prudence, and Uncle Lindenbrock heard me. "What's the matter?" he asked. "Look," I told him, pointing at the varied succession of sandstones and limestones and the first indications of slate. "And?" "We're now in the period when the first plants and animals appeared," I said. "Do you think so?" "Well, look at it, examine it, study it." I forced the professor to move his lamp over the walls of the tunnel. I expected some outcry on his part, but he didn't say a word and continued on his way. Had he understood me or not? Did he refuse to admit, out of self-love as an uncle and a scholar, that he had made a mistake when he chose the Eastern Tunnel, or was he determined to explore this passage all the way to the end? It was obvious that we had left the lava path and that this route could not possibly lead to the fiery core of the Snaffels. Yet, I wondered if I was not attributing too much importance to this change in rock. Was I mistaken? Were we really crossing the layers of rock above the granite foundation of the earth? If I'm right, I thought, I should find some residue of primitive plants, and then we'll have to acknowledge the evidence. So let's look. I had not gone even 100 paces before incontestable proof presented itself. It could not be otherwise. For in the Silurian age, seas contained at least 1,500 vegetable and animal species. My feet, which had become accustomed to the hard lava ground, suddenly touched dust composed of plant and shell residue. On the walls were distinct impressions of fungi and lycopods. Professor Lindenbrock must have noticed, but he closed his eyes, I imagine, and kept going with a steady step. This was stubbornness, pushed beyond all bounds. I couldn't hold it in any longer. I picked up a perfectly formed shell, which had belonged to an animal not unlike a woodlouse, and then joining my uncle, I said, "Look!" "Very well," he replied quietly. "It's the shell of a crustacean, of an extinct species called a trilobite, nothing more." But don't you conclude from this? What you conclude? Yes, I do perfectly. We've left the granite and the lava. It's possible that I made a mistake, but I can't be sure of that unless I've reached the end of the tunnel. You're right in doing this, Uncle, and I would approve if there were not a more and more threatening danger. What danger? Our lack of water? Well, Axel, we'll just put ourselves on rations. And that is the end of the chapter. Oh, I don't like the idea of water rationing. There is a picture, and it is a picture of the fossils in the rock that Axel has identified. Very cool. I see a nautilus, a fern, and possibly a coral in there. I don't know. What do you guys see? Anyway, I'm going to grab a drink, and then we're going to do another chapter. So give me 1 minute, and I'll be right back. All right, that's better. You know, I don't think Axel realizes that even if he's right, and even if they popped back up in Iceland or even in Germany, all his uncle would do is turn around, go back, and go down the other passage. So I don't think he's going to get what he's hoping for, which is going back and seeing his darling Grauben. So with that, let us jump back in and read chapter 20 of Journey to the Center of the Earth by Jules Verne. Indeed, we did have to ration ourselves. Our supply of water could not last more than 3 days. I found that out for certain when dinner time came. Dismal prospect. We had little hope of finding a source in these rocks of the transitionary period. The whole next day, the tunnel opened its endless arcades before us, and we moved almost without a word. Hans's silence had spread to us. The road was not ascending now, at least not perceptibly. Sometimes it even seemed to slope downward, but this tendency, which was at any rate very slight, did not reassure the professor, for there was no change in the nature of the strata, and the transition period became more and more manifest. Electric lights made the schist, the limestone, and the old red sandstone in the walls glitter. One might have thought that we were passing through an open trench in Devonshire, the region whose name has been given to this type of soil. Magnificent marble specimens covered the walls, some of a grayish agate with the veins fancifully outlined in white, others in a crimson color, or yellow dotted with spots of red. Farther on, samples of dark cherry red marbles in which limestone showed up in bright colors. The greater part of this marble bore impressions of primitive organisms. Creation had made obvious progress since the previous day. Instead of rudimentary trilobites, I noticed remains of a more perfect order of beings, amongst others granoid fishes and some of those saurians in which paleontologists have discovered the earliest reptile forms. The Devonian seas were inhabited by animals of these species and deposited them by thousands in the newly formed rocks. It was obvious that we were ascending the scale of animal life in which man holds the highest place, but Professor Lindenbrock seemed not to care. He was waiting for one of two events. Either that a vertical well would be opening under his feet and allow him to resume his descent, or that an obstacle would prevent him from continuing on this route. But evening came and his hopes were not fulfilled. On Friday, after a night during which I began to feel the pangs of thirst, our little troop again plunged into the winding passages of the tunnel. After 10 hours of walking, I noticed that the reflection of our lamps on the walls diminished strangely. The marble, the schist, the limestone, and the sandstone were giving way to dark and lusterless linings. At one moment, when the tunnel had become very narrow, I leaned against the wall. When I pulled back my hand, it was black. I looked more closely. We were in a coal formation. "A coal mine?" I exclaimed. "A mine without miners," my uncle said. Who knows?" I told him. "I know," the professor said decidedly. "I'm certain that this tunnel piercing through the layers of coals was never created by the hand of man. But whether it's the work of nature or not doesn't matter. Dinner time! Let's have dinner." Hans prepared some food, but I scarcely ate, and I swallowed the few drops of water rationed out to me. One half-filled flask was all we had left to quench the thirst of 3 men. After their meal, my companions laid down on their blankets and found sleep a remedy for their exhaustion, but I couldn't sleep, so I counted the hours until morning. On Saturday, at 6, we started anew. In 20 minutes, we reached a vast open space. I then knew that the hand of man could not have been hollowing out this coal mine. The vaults would have been shored up, and really they seemed to be held up only by a miracle of equilibrium. This cavern was about 100 feet wide and 150 feet high. The ground had been pushed aside by a subterranean motion. The massive rock, impacted by a powerful thrust, had been displaced, leaving this large empty space that inhabitants of the earth were entering for the very first time. The whole history of the Carboniferous period was written on those dark walls, and a geologist might with ease trace all of its diverse phases. The beds of coal were separated by strata of sandstone or compact clay and appeared crushed by the strata above them. At the age of the world which preceded the secondary period, the earth was covered with immense vegetable forms, produced by the double influence of tropical heat and constant moisture. A vaporous atmosphere had enveloped the earth, depriving it again of the direct rays of the sun. Hence the conclusion that the high temperature was due to some other source than the heat of the sun. Perhaps the day star was not ready yet to play its brilliant role. There were no climates as yet, and a torrid heat, equal from the pole to the equator, spread out over the whole surface of the earth. Where did it come from? Was it from the interior of the earth? Notwithstanding Professor Lindenbrock's theories, a violent heat did at that time smolder in the bowels of our spheroid. Its effect was felt up to the very last layers of the terrestrial crust. The plants, deprived of the beneficent influence of the sun, produced neither flowers nor scent, but their roots drew vigorous life from the burning soil of those first days. There were only a few trees, just herbaceous plants, enormous meadows, ferns, lycopods, silurians, astrophilites, rare families whose species had numbered in the thousands back then. Coal owes its existence to this period of vegetation. The still flexible crust of the earth followed the movements of the liquid masses that it covered. Hence, numerous fissures and depressions. The plants, pushed underwater, gradually accumulated in considerable quantities. Then the reactions of natural chemistry intervened at the bottom of the oceans, and the vegetable accumulations first became peat, and then, due to the influence of the gases and the heat of fermentation, they underwent a process of complete mineralization. In a way, these coal fields were then formed, which excessive exploitation will nonetheless exhaust in less than 3 centuries in less industrialized countries put a stop to it. These reflections came to my mind while I was contemplating the mineral wealth stored in this part of the globe. Undoubtedly, I thought, these deposits will never be discovered. The exploitation of such deep mines would require too large of a sacrifice, and what would be the use as long as coal is spread far and wide closer to the surface? Therefore, such as I see these intact layers, they will stay when the world finally comes to an end. But still we marched on, and I alone forgot the length of the way by losing myself in the midst of geological contemplations. The temperature remained what it had been during our passage through the lava and the schist. Only my sense of smell was affected by the odor of hydrocarbon. I immediately recognized in this tunnel the presence of a considerable quantity of the dangerous gas called fire damp by miners, whose explosions had often caused dreadful catastrophes. Thankfully, our light came from the Ruhmkorff device. If by misfortune we had carelessly explored this tunnel with torches, a terrible explosion would have put an end to the traveling by eliminating the 3 travelers. This excursion through the coal formation lasted until night. My uncle could scarcely restrain his impatience at the horizontal road. The darkness, as always 20 steps ahead of us, prevented us from estimating the length of the tunnel, and I was beginning to think that it was endless when suddenly, at 6 o'clock, a wall very unexpectedly rose in front of us. Right or left, top or bottom, there was no passage. We were at the end of a blind alley. "Well, all the better," said my uncle. "I know what the facts are. We are not on Sakmusen's route, and all we have to do is go back. Let's have a night's rest, and in 3 days we'll be back to the point where the 2 tunnels branched." "Yeah," I said, "if we have any strength left." "And why wouldn't we?" Well, because tomorrow we won't have any water left at all. And you won't have any courage, said my uncle, giving me a severe look. And to that, I dared make no answer at all. And that is the end of the chapter. Things are looking kind of dire for our intrepid travelers. I don't think I could walk 3 days without water, especially since there's no water back where the tunnels branched either. I think I would have carried a lot more water with me. I think I would have given up the guns for water. Although who knows what we're going to find when we venture further on. Since we are definitely at the halfway point now, obviously there's going to be a lot more going on. And I have not read ahead. So all I'm doing now is just kind of flipping and seeing if there are any pictures that look like they give away what's coming. And I don't know. Are we going to find Lemurians in the center of the earth? Isn't that, or is Lemurians the ones that are on the moon? I'm not big on conspiracy theories, so I can't keep them all straight. But I'm really enjoying this. I'm also enjoying the scientific theories that were probably cutting edge back in the 1800s when this book was written, that definitely aren't exactly current theories now. So this is being a lot of fun to read. This has been a lot of fun to read. I'm enjoying it, and I hope you are too. So thank you so much for listening. I hope that you enjoyed tonight's chapter. Please do leave me a thumbs up if you don't mind. It does always make me smile. And let me know what you guys are thinking of this story in the comments down below. And I will see you tomorrow.